Hi, and welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Christina Langell. Joining me today is Pennsylvania editor Kristen Smith. Kristen, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, thanks. So today we're going to talk about the special election that happened in Lancaster that was a bit of an upset. So can you tell us a little bit more about what happened with this traditionally Republican seat?
I think a bit of an upset is a charitable way of putting it from the Republicans. This was a big upset, I think. I mean, you're talking Lancaster County, home to the largest Amish population in Pennsylvania. Now, traditionally, they don't vote, and it appears that they didn't vote here. But this is a comfortably Republican district. And in fact, they went heavily for Trump and U.S. Senator McCormick in November. And funnily enough, McCormick kind of has a role to play in all of this. So when he ascended to the U.S. Senate, he obviously recruited new staff, one of which was Senator Ryan Aument, who represented this district since 2016. And it's important to note that Republicans have been representing some form of this region since at least the 1970s. So, I mean, we're talking a very big upset. Now, in terms of votes, you're only looking at less than 500 votes, which is very small. Even in a low turnout election, which this was, less than 1/3 of voters came to the polls. But I think what's important here is it's really the first test of a post-Trump election, because I think we can all agree that Trump has a very unique impact on elections, and specifically in Pennsylvania. I mean, we're not traditionally a swing state, but the Trump effect here is very effective. And there's lots of reasons why. We won't get into those, but this was a very interesting turn of events for lots of reasons. Now, the winner of the election is East Petersburg Mayor James Malone, and he triumphed over Lancaster County Commissioner Josh Parsons, who is traditionally seen as, more aligned with Trump's values than, say, a moderate Republican. And again, it seemed like a pretty obvious choice that he would be chosen. But I think what you're seeing here is that not only is without Trump's impact, without his coattails, you're not going to see that it's not going to be a guaranteed win, as well as there's obviously a lot of concern growing among the electorate. And were Democrats really fired up about coming out? Obviously, apparently. But you have to wonder, too, did Republicans, why did they stay home? Why didn't they show up? Were they just concerned? Did they just feel like, obviously, it's going to win, which there probably were a lot. But it's just a really interesting turn of events. And is it a one-off? Or are Republicans, particularly in the Senate, where their majority has dwindled from, 7 to 8 seats down to 6, now we're down to 4. And Senate Republicans are the only thing that stands between a completely Democratic state government, because you have Democrats narrowly in control of the House. You have Governor Josh Shapiro, who pretty much always falls in line with what House Democrats want. And so if you lose that Senate, Republicans, who have been so used to having so much control in the state legislature for the last 10 to 15 years, that's gone. And what does our government look like after that? So this is a very interesting development, but what does it mean for future elections, the midterms? It's hard to say. Special elections are different in their own right. So it is just really interesting in that respect.
It's interesting, too, because I think about Lancaster and how it's changed. I mean, of course, people think of Lancaster, they think of the Amish, they think that's probably a very conservative area, but Lancaster City specifically is a pretty young and pretty urban. I would say it's kind of a hip sort of posh place to live, actually.
Yes, it really is. And growing there. I think as two people who are from central Pennsylvania, I think we would agree that Lancaster has a lot more stuff than we do. And we live in the fastest growing county. So riddle me that, but
for sure. I wonder do you think that the election kind of shows some of that move out into, I guess they're calling it like the exurbs, like more people moving from the Philadelphia region into Lancaster and just like out into the county? Because I know that, of course, like Lancaster City is not necessarily the
Well, right. And I think what's interesting too is sometimes when you divide Pennsylvania up into regions, people have a very different interpretation of what Southeast Pennsylvania is, right? And sometimes Lancaster is in there. So I think that points to that suggestion. And what's interesting too about Lancaster and how we mentioned it before, that it did skew heavily Trump. And I started to get into this. When you take Trump out of the election, especially a national election, and you start looking at more state level politics, let's go back to the governor's race in 2022. We did have one statewide race, which was for Senate, and that's when Fetterman defeated Oz, who was Trump backed. But mostly you were looking at statewide candidates who were really carrying the ballot. In that case, Doug Mastriano, who is a senator and quite right wing in that sense, and did have Trump's backing, he tanked. He just did not do well. And I think he did worse than even people were expecting, not just because Josh Shapiro is a moderate candidate who seems to play well with a lot of the electorate, but almost because his Trump alignment, I don't know. I've been saying it for years, but it's hard to express. Trump has a very specific following in the fact that, you know, even though he's this millionaire and he has lived a life that the majority of people have not and will never experience, he just really resonates with people in Pennsylvania. I think there's this working class, blue collar, sentiment that is widespread. It's in unions, it's in coal towns, it's in rural Pennsylvania. And when those areas unite, you see a challenge to these more populated Democratic centers. And so, but without him, and when you have Republicans at the state level who try to mimic him, it doesn't seem to land in the same way. And I'm not saying that Josh Parsons tried to be, a mini Donald Trump. But what I am saying is that they can't seem to hope, or they can't emulate him because he seems to be very specific in the way that he is, in the way that he connects with voters. And so is it the voters want Trump, or is it that voters want Republicans, or is it that they just want Trump because they have trust in Trump to rise above the politics of it? And that is something that I don't think we're going to understand until we start getting into these midterms and start seeing how votes are going, and quite frankly, how 2028 plays out with the presidential election when Trump is no longer there.
Yeah, I think, especially looking at, how Josh Shapiro framed it as, aligning him with Trump, it was an interesting look at it.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Well, thank you so much, Kristen. I really look forward to seeing how the balance of power continues to change and play out in Pennsylvania politics. And you can follow it all at thecentersquare.com/Pennsylvania.